So then the question came to me, do I believe in God? And I don't like that question. And people have complained at me a lot, and I'm sure they have their reasons because they don't like my answers, you know, and I have two answers. They've kind of become stock, which is not a good thing. But they're the best approximate. I can't figure out why I don't like the question exactly. I've got I had three sort of burgeoning hypotheses. One was, it's none of your damn business. That's the first one. So it's like a privacy issue. Like it seemed to me to be a question that was too private to be answered properly. And so, and you know, you could consider that a cop-out, and maybe it is. And then another one was, well, what do you mean by believe? Like, do you mean the words? Do you mean to say the words, I believe in God? Does that indicate that you believe in God? Like, I don't know what you mean by believe exactly, because, and that's got me in trouble too, because, you know, people think that attempting to clarify the meaning of words is an attempt to escape from the question when it's actually an attempt to specify the question. I mean, is what you believe what you say or what you act out? Now, you know, I would say to some degree it's both, but if push comes to shove, as far as I'm concerned, what you believe is what you act out, not what you say. And then, you know, and if you're an integrated person, then what you act out and what you say are the same thing, and then you're a person whose word can be trusted, right? Because what you say and what you do are isomorphic. They're the same thing. But belief is instantiated in action. So I have also suggested that I act as if I believe in God, or to the best of my ability. And people aren't very happy with that either. And then the third is that I'm afraid that he might exist, which I think is the most comical of the three answers and perhaps the most accurate one. But then I was thinking about this today when I was thinking about what I might talk to you guys about. And I thought, well, let's go into this a little bit more. Let's say you do believe in God. Say, I believe in God. It's like, okay, well, that's hypothetically pretty impressive, I would say. It's like you believe that there's a divine power that oversees everything, that is fundamentally ethical, that's watching everything you do, and you believe that. And so what effect does that have on your behavior if you believe it? Does that mean that you're, well, are you all in on your beliefs? Are you sacrificing everything to this transcendent entity that you proclaim belief in? Have you cleansed yourself of all your sin, let's say? Are you making all the sacrifices that you need to make? Like, have you taken the mote out of your eye? No? Or are you in the same situation, let's say, that the Catholic Church seems to be in right now? Just out of curiosity, it's a good time to bring that up, since the Pope seems to be concerned with what's been happening with the Catholic Church, given the endless pedophilic scandals, let's say, which seem rather serious in my estimation, and might have been something that was cleaned up perhaps 100 or 1,000 years ago. And it's being taken seriously perhaps now, and perhaps not, because it's not so easy to determine exactly what it would mean to take that seriously. And you might say, well, are all the people who are committing these heinous actions and then covering them up, if you ask them, well, do you believe in God? What are they going to say? Well, you'd think the answer would be yes, given that they're like priests, and yet, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence isn't exactly so clear that the mere statement, let's say, or the mere acting out of the ritual, let's say, and I'm not trying to denigrate the statement or the ritual, but I'm pointing out that that's no indication of you're right to say that you believe, because you got to, and I think this is why it's bothered me to answer this question. It's like, well, what right do I have to say that, to make that claim? I believe in God. Well, what's the claim? Is that the claim that I'm a good person somehow? Because you'd think that if you believed in God, actually, like seriously, that you'd be a good person, like right now, because, well, Well, for obvious reasons, I would think. And so if that hasn't happened in some sort of miraculous sense, so that you're the best person you could possibly imagine being on an ongoing basis, and then terrified of deviating from that path in a serious manner, then I don't see why you have the right to say that you believe in God. You know, one of the things Nietzsche said about Christianity, he was a great critic of Christianity, although also a great friend in a very peculiar way, in that sometimes your best friend is the one who points out your weakest properties, let's say. He said, as far as he was concerned, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. And that's a, you know, perhaps an extreme statement, but one worth giving some consideration to. It's like, well, then you look at what are you called upon? Let's say if you're going to proclaim yourself as a believer, you know. And I thought about this a lot as I've gone through the Old Testament. I did a bunch of lectures last year, and so what are you called upon? Well, you're called upon initially to act out the spark of divinity that's within you by confronting potential with the logos that's within you, which means to take the opportunities that are in front of you, the potential future, and to transform it into the present in the best possible way, using truth and courage and careful articulation as your guide. So that's the first thing you're called on to do. That's a major deal there. That's a tough one. And then the second is to make the proper sacrifices. That's the Cain and Abel story. Is like you want something, you genuinely want it, you want to set the world straight, then you let go of what's necessary and you pursue. You let go of what isn't necessary, no matter what it is, and then you pursue what's necessary. And God only knows how hard you need to be pushed in order to go beyond where you are. But you know, to some degree, if you have a choice, you know, it's not that uncommon that what we'll do is choose to be pushed to the limit, especially when we're at our best. We think, wow, where's the limit? It's here. Maybe I can manage that. I'm going to push myself right to the damn limit. And then I'm going to push myself a little bit over just to see if it's possible. And if that happens, then, you know, you emerge with a sense of triumph. I'm now more than I was, right? And maybe that's what you're here to be, is to be more than you were, right? To push those limits. And to do that, you contend with the world. You wrestle with God. You don't casually say, I believe. We contend, we wrestle. You know, and in that maybe we find our destiny. At least we find our purpose. We find something that justifies us to some degree. You know, if I'm awake at night wondering and I think, God, you know, like I pushed myself as far as I could in this effort, whatever the effort that I'm considering happens to be. I pushed myself. I don't have a weight on my conscience because I let something go or I failed to accomplish something. I mean, I do often have those sorts of weights. I'm talking about the rare times when I don't. It's like, well, there's something that's where there's some atonement and some peace as far as I'm concerned, where that contending and that wrestling has been successful. And I would say that insofar as you're deeply involved in that, like completely involved in that, thoroughly involved in that, then you have the right to say that you believe in God. And since I'm not like that 100% of the time, or even approximating the percent of the time that I would like to be like that, you know, despite my best efforts, then when people ask me, I'm not going to say something virtuous like I'm a believer, because there's plenty wrong with me that needs to be fixed before I would dare utter words like that. Thank you.
God, in the highest sense, is the spirit that you must emulate in order to thrive. Spirit is a pattern. The spirit that you must emulate in order to thrive.
Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle, and we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal, and it's put in personified form. It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay, because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning, properly social, and properly competent individual. We're trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment, you need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means. And that's what we've been driving at. One of the things that happens in the translation, in the movement, let's say, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, is God is obviously blessing creation in the beginning of this story. And then you have Old Testament God, and like, don't mess around with him, right? Because he'll give you good smiting if you get out of line. There's no doubt about that. And he's kind of an arbitrary character. And, you know, lots of modern people think, well, how could you believe in a God like that? And it's like, when I read that, I think, well, the Old Testament people, that isn't how they thought. They thought, you better look the hell out, because life is really difficult, and if you step out of line, you're going to get flattened, and God doesn't care, in some sense, whether you approve of him. It's like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? Obviously, you don't approve. It's like, you better pay attention, though, because otherwise you're going to be in real trouble. And there's real wisdom in that. Nietzsche really admired the Old Testament as a work of literature, because he thought that the representation of the divine, let's say, as a representation of the essential nature of being was extraordinarily accurate in its arbitrary and often cruel nature. You know, it wasn't following a morality that human beings could really understand as moral, but he thought that was very realistic, and I like that interpretation. But what happens in the New Testament is quite interesting, because there's an insistence all of a sudden in the New Testament that you're supposed to act towards God as if he's nothing but good. And that's such a strange thing, because you look at the world and you think, yeah, really? Just good, eh? Well, the cancer and the earthquakes is kind of hard to fit into that picture. And, you know, the terrible things that happen to children and all of that is very difficult to square with the notion of a good God, obviously. But then the underlying idea is that if you act in that manner, it makes it more likely to be true. It's something like that. And so I would consider that in some sense an act of both courage and faith. It's like you're going to make the case, like God makes at the beginning of the Bible, that being is in fact good. Now, you can't see it because, well, you get to see all the things about it that aren't so good. That's not the point. It's a metaphysical presupposition, something like that. It's a decision to act that way. I'm going to act as if being is good, and to further that. And then the implicit idea is, well, there isn't any way that you can make things work out better than to do that. And so there's a courageous element to it, which I think is also expressed to some degree in the idea of Christ's voluntary sacrifice of his own life. His presupposition was something like, I'm going to act as if God is good, and I'm going to play that out right to the end. And now that becomes something like a divine pattern. And the heroic thing to do is to accept that, and not even to accept it grudgingly. To say, all right, I'm going to go along with that, I'm going to accept that, and I'm going to act nonetheless as if being is good, and then I'm going to see how things turn out. It's something like that. And so it's an act of courage, right? There's an act of courage that's associated with that transformation of attitude. And even with regards to the notion that the world is good, it's a courageous attitude, especially given that there's so much evidence that makes that conclusion difficult to continually draw. So maybe we should go along with it and see what we can do with it, you know, and see how we could make it better, because we certainly could if we were really committed to it, and we shook our resentment and our anger and our hatred. And I know there's reason for all of that, because people do suffer terribly, but you know, God only knows what being could be like if we all contributed to it to the best of our ability. God only knows what we could conquer, and what sort of magnificent cities we could produce, and what things we could eradicate from the suffering of the world. If you're studying information, you can't study it objectively, precisely, because as you study the information, you get informed. That changes you. And so the problem with studying this sort of thing is that you can't study it without being changed. Because if you're not changed by studying it, you're not studying it. You're no anthropologist who's outside of this. You can't be. Because if you're outside of it, you don't understand it. Because if you understand it, then you're not the same person anymore.
So you can't keep it at bay. If you study religion properly, it will demolish your personality. Your personality, like the personality that's you, is like the dead branches on a pine tree. It's like you might be clinging to them because you think, well, I'm all these dead branches. It's like, well, yeah, but first of all, you should let go of them. And second, you should let them burn off. And then you might think, well, I don't want them to burn off because that's me. It's like, yeah, that's true. But it's the false you that you're clinging to. Well, that doesn't mean you want to be burned up in the flames. So to study this material properly is to be burned up in the flames. And there's no escaping that. You're just not in it if that doesn't happen. You don't get it. Like one of the things I realized when I started studying this was that virtually everything I said was a lie. I would say 99%. And by lie, I mean it was manipulative, it was unclear, it was vague, and that was all often motivated, or it was a false attempt to gain dominant status, which is typical of someone who's intellectual. It's like, well, I've got these ideas, I've taken them from places, and now I can use them as, say, status weapons, something like that, which is what people do when they're trying to win an argument, say. It's like, that's all lies. It's like, well, that's rough when it's 99% of what you say. First of all, the first thing you realize is how much you aren't. You're not Nietzsche. You know, you have your experience as your claim to reality, and it's often pretty thin. But the development of authentic speech is worth the price that you have to pay for it.
Part of the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is to try to address the void, let's say, and I suspect that many of you are actually here because you would like to have the void addressed. And so the way it looks to me is something like this, and this is what I've derived in part from my studies of religious tradition. So I could say that at the beginning of Genesis, for example, there's a proposition that it's truthful speech that generates habitable order from chaotic potential. That seems to me to be the fundamental narrative, and I do believe there's something dead accurate and real about that, because we do generate the world as a consequence of our communicative effort. And then there's a second proposition, which is that the world that we generate from the chaos of potential is habitable to the degree that the communication that we engage in is truthful. And that's why God, who uses the logos at the beginning of time to generate the world, is able to say that his creation is good. The proposition is the world you bring into being through truthful speech is good. And that's the image of God that's implanted in man and woman. And there's a grandeur about that idea. And you think, well, you don't need the grandeur because it's just a fiction. It's like, just wait a second here. It's not just a fiction, unless you don't believe that in some manner you partake in the creation of the world and that you have an ultimate responsibility that might well be described as divine to participate in that process properly, truthfully, and with love. And there's every reason to think that that's an elevated ideal so high that it's worthy of conceptualizing as divine, and also to presume that it represents some fundamental metaphysical reality.